Hello everyone, it's Scott and we're back for day 2 of Aetherdrift spoilers. So today we got less cards than we did yesterday. We got over 50 cards yesterday that we had to look at. So this will be a little bit more compact today, but we do have a couple gods from Amonkhet and a couple of red cards that I think have some potential for standard playability. So before we dive in, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Aetherdrift spoiler season and beyond. So let's dive in. So first we've got Ketramos, the New Dawn. For 1, a white and a black mana, you get a legendary creature that's a god and is a 4/4 with menace, lifelink, and indestructible. And Ketramos can attack or block unless there are 7 or more cards in exile. And whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from graveyards and or the battlefield during your turn, you draw a card and lose 1 life. So it's encouraging things to happen on your turn. Now, what I think will make this work the best is using Leyline of the Void or Rest in Peace as a way to make sure that any cards that would be going into the graveyard are only going to be going into exile to get to that 7. And you do have the nice advantage of when things do go into the graveyard, they are going to go into exile if you've got one of those 2 cards in play. And because of that, I think Ketramos in that style of deck where things are going to automatically go into exile, I think this card will work. Now, is it that kind of deck going to be good enough for standard? Right now, I don't think it is, but it's a very interesting card design, and we'll see if it really has a place in standard. Next, we've got Sunan Luxa Embodied. For 3, a green and a blue mana. You get a legendary creature that's a god and is a 6/6. It has reach, trample, and indestructible, and Subsunan can't attack or block unless it has an even number of counters on it, and 0 is an even number. And at the beginning of your first main phase, put a +1/+1 counter on Subsunan. Then, if it has an odd number of counters on it, you get to draw 2 cards. So, very interesting way of getting this guy to activate where you have to have an even number of counters on it. So, the turn it comes into play, it'll have obviously 0. So if you have a way to give it haste, you could attack on the turn it comes into play. But then on every other subsequent turn, you get to draw 2 cards, which I think is a pretty powerful ability. So I think this definitely has standard playability in the right deck. And we are seeing some additional good Simic cards that we're getting from not only Aetherdrift, but the past couple of sets. So maybe there's actually a pretty good Simic deck out there for cards like this. Next, we have Samut, the Driving Force. For 3, a red, a green, and a white mana. You get a legendary creature that's a human warrior cleric and is a 4/5 with first strike, vigilance, and haste. Samut also has the Start Your Engine ability, and when you have started the engine, okay, whatever your speed is, that's going to get applied to other things, which I think is going to make Samut a very interesting card in standard. So other creatures you control get +X+0, where X is your speed. So immediately when Samut comes into play, all of your creatures will get a +1 boost at that point. And then also non-creature spells you cast will cost X less to cast, where X is your speed. So again, immediately all your non-creature spells are going to cost 1 less. So I think Samut, even though it's 6 mana, I think this is a playable card in standard because of the abilities that are attached to Samut. And it's possible that when Samut comes into play, if you're using other cards that have Start Your Engine on them, you could give your creatures a 2 or 3 or even 4 power boost by doing that, and then also immediately reduce the cost of those non-creature spells by 2, 3, or 4. In my mind, that makes Samut a card that it will be an interesting build around in standard. Now, will it be enough to be a really competitive deck? I'm not sure on that one, but these are abilities that make a card like this desirable, and I think one that we have to keep an eye on for standard playability. Next, we've got our first red card of the day, and that's Count on Luck. For 3 red, you get an enchantment, and at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So really nice card here. Now, I don't know in the current mono red builds that we have in standard if this makes the cut, but I could see this actually going into the prowess decks as a way of getting additional cards to allow you that ability to cast 2 or 3 spells on a turn, get those prowess buffs because of it. So I think this potentially has a home in standard. It's probably never going to be a 4 of in any deck, but I think it could be, a 1 or 2 of in the right deck. And like we see with similar cards to this, like Phyrexian Arena, we don't see usually 4 copies of that, but a couple of copies of that are at times in black decks. So I think this has got some standard playability because of that. Next, we've got Market Back Walker. For X and X, you get an artifact creature. That's a construct with 0 power and toughness. And this creature enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. So for every 2 mana you spend, you get a +1/+1 counter to go on Market Back Walker. Then later you can add for 4 mana an additional +1/+1 counter to this creature, and this is an activated ability, and we do have a number of cards so far that we've seen from the set that provide mana for activated abilities like this. So I think, this is certainly something that potentially has standard playability, and a nice thing about the card is that when it dies, you get to draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. So say you play it for 4 mana, it's got 2 +1/+1 counters on it. When it dies, you get to draw 2 cards, and maybe over the course of the game, you can add a +1/+1 counter to it or 2, and having that card draw when this dies, I think makes this standard playable as we're looking at where we're headed with decks going forward. Next, we've got another red card that I think has some standard playability, and that's Full Throttle. For 4 and 2 red mana. You get a sorcery, and after this main phase, there are 2 additional combat phases. At the beginning of each combat, this turn, untap all creatures that attack this turn. So this is, a 6 mana, get 2 additional attacks in, and most of the time, if you're able to successfully do that, you're simply going to win the game under those circumstances. So I think, probably not going to see a lot of play in standard, but I think this is a fantastic card for Commander, where you're going to be playing against 3 other players. So not only can you attack each of them, with a few creatures on a given turn, but now you could spend a full combat phase attacking each of your opponents in Commander. So I think this is a card to watch out for in Commander in red decks, because extra combat phases are a very, very good ability. And we do have a number of cards already in Standard that when you get that additional combat phase, there's a benefit to that. And I think Full Throttle is a card that is going to have that kind of impact in Commander and maybe some other formats. Next, we've got Voyager Glidecar. For a white mana, you get an artifact vehicle, and it's a 2/3. And when this vehicle enters, you get to scry 1, and then you can tap 3 other untapped creatures you control, and until end of turn, this vehicle becomes an artifact creature and gains flying, and you can put a +1/+1 counter on it. So that's a pretty interesting and nice ability on this. So it gives you an alternate way to crew it, in essence, by tapping those creatures. And it also gives it flying, and then again that +1/+1 counter on it. So there's a way to grow it over the course of a game, and it only has a crew cost of 1. So I think there's some standard playability to this. Maybe you play this on turn 1, and then on turn 2, you're playing a creature, and immediately you're going to be able to crew this and attack with it. Next, we've got Thopter Fabricator. For 2 and a blue mana, you get an artifact vehicle. That's a 4/4 with flying, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and it crews for 2. So I want to believe this is a really good card and it could be great, but we already have cards like this in standard that are not vehicles that don't see play. So my assumption is that this one won't either because we really don't have a dedicated deck that's draw a second card each turn. Now, if we had a guaranteed way to do that, then sure, I think this is a very powerful card because you're going to be creating an additional 1/1 colorless Thopter each turn that happens. So if we could get that situation to be a consistently we draw two, I think then Thopter Fabricator is a fine card to put in that style of deck. But otherwise, I think it's going to be just something we see in limited. Next, we've got our first lower rarity card of the day, and that's we've got Marauding Mako for a red mana. You get a Shark Pirate, that's a 1/1. And when you discard one or more cards, put that many +1/+1 counters on this card, and it can also be cycled for 2. So I see Marauding Mako going in an Is It Spells deck where we are naturally using cantrips that are going to draw cards, and then we also have to discard. And we do have a number of cards in standard already where you draw a card and then discard. So I think in that style of deck, Marauding Mako really would take advantage of that, and you could grow this very quickly into a fairly large creature. So I think this has standard playability and maybe one of the better cards actually of the day for standard playability. Next, we've got Cloudspire Coordinator for a red and a white mana. You get a human pilot, that's a 3/1. And when this creature enters the battlefield, you get to scry 2, and you can tap it and create X 1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens, where X is the number of mounts and or vehicles that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. This token saddles mounts and cruise vehicles as though it had power were 2 greater. So very interesting card here. So obviously this can crew pretty much anything we've seen for the most part from Aetherdrift so far in terms of the vehicles. But I think the interesting thing about this really is that ability, hey, I'm going to play them out, then I tap this, and I immediately get something that can crew that because I played them out or I played a vehicle. And under those circumstances, in that kind of deck, I think this actually is a pretty good card and maybe a sleeper card to help make that deck more consistent and give it more ways to get creatures onto the battlefield that can either saddle or crew a mount or a vehicle. Next, we've got Hour of Victory for 2 and a black mana. You get an enchantment with Start Your Engine, and when this enchantment enters the battlefield, you get to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. And when you reach max speed, you can pay 1 and a black mana and sacrifice this enchantment, and then you get to search your library for a card, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. Activate only as a sorcery. So I think this has actually another card that is a really nice utility card. You get a creature, and then when you reach max velocity, then you get to go search your deck for whatever card you need at that given point. And because of that, I think this is a card that will see standard play in its time in standard. All right, and our last card of the day is Brightfield Mustang for 3 and a white mana. You get a horse mount, that's a 3/3. And whenever this creature attacks while saddled, untap it and put a +1/+1 counter on it, and its saddle cost is 1. So this is a common, but it's a nice limited card. I feel like that this is a card, if I saw it in my limited pool, I would definitely want to consider this because, hey, you saddle it the first time you can attack with it, and now it's a 4/4, and in essence it gets vigilance when you saddle it, because that's what the untapping is actually doing, is giving it vigilance. And because of that, I think this has the potential to be a really good card in limited and has an outside chance of seeing a little bit of standard play. All right, those are the cards from day 2 of Aetherdrift spoiler season. I've left links here to the day 1 preview videos for rares and mythic rares from the set. And thanks for staying to the end of the video. And remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Aetherdrift spoiler season and beyond. Thanks. I'll see you next time.